And while our attitudes towards smoking have changed dramatically and appropriately, in some respects, our approaches to cessation remain outdated. Salim Youssef again shows that smoking as few as 6 cigarettes a day causes a doubling of the risk of myocardial infarction, and smoking 2 packs a day causes an increase that is 8-fold that of a non-smoker. And not only is this a highly effective intervention, it's a highly cost-effective intervention. Using the standard metric of cost per life year saved, you see that smoking cessation costs between $2,000 and $6,000, a figure which is falling. Per life year saved through the treatment of hypertension, a process which obviously is profoundly important, but which can take years, if not decades, before the benefits are expressed or experienced, costs between $9,000 and $26,000, and the treatment of hyperlipidemia can cost almost $200,000 per life year saved. It's also very powerful from the point of view of numbers needed to treat. Help 9 people stop smoking, you save 1 life. Pneumococcal vaccine, 716, pap smears, 530. The statistics are obvious. And by the way, and let me be somewhat inflammatory or provocative, but if you've got patients who are smokers, don't worry too much about getting their hypertension down to acceptable levels. Don't spend your nights agonizing about how you're going to get their LDL levels to Canadian consensus guidelines. Because your assumption of the benefits of treating hypertension and dyslipidemia in smokers is that it's an assumption. And as clinicians, you know, we all learn very early in our careers never to make assumptions. That was a fact that was driven home to me again a few weeks ago, because in the far west of Ottawa, there's this Cineplex place that has this bizarre practice of giving seniors discounts to incredibly young people. And so I went to the movies, and 2 thoughts were going through my mind. I got a heck of a deal on a movie ticket, and secondly, the end is near. But a row ahead of me, there was this very voluble, very energetic conversation taking place, and I made the assumption, never make assumptions, that when the popcorn commercials disappeared, so too would the conversation. It didn't. And so I felt that if I summoned up all those clinical skills and professional sensitivities that were honed in Kingston so many, many years ago, I might be able to intervene and affect the trajectory of this conversation. And so I leaned forward and I tapped one of the participants on the shoulder and I said, "Excuse me, but I can't hear a single word." And she turned to me quite sharply and said, "You're not supposed to. This is a totally personal conversation." Never make assumptions. Let me introduce you to a woman I met in the hospital in Ottawa many, many months ago. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. We traveled 6 or 7 floors together. She was very forceful, very articulate, very insightful, very intelligent. Turns out she was a young member of Canada's Foreign Service. She was wearing nothing but a pale blue hospital gown. She was attached to an IV pole. She was pushing herself outside. She was very agitated. She was very forceful. The temperature that morning in Ottawa was minus 24 Celsius. This was a slide prepared for an American audience who still used 19th century measurement techniques, and so a translation was made available. Ladies and gentlemen, intelligent and unintelligent, old or young people do not find it necessary to push IV poles wearing next to no clothing outside the front doors of hospitals in the middle of the night when it's minus 24 Celsius. And it's important that we understand that this is one of the most tenacious addictions that we deal with in our community. And if we look at the standard references, we see that the likelihood of becoming dependent or addicted to a substance following only one exposure is highest for tobacco than for any other substance in the community. That addiction is aided, or that propensity to be addictive is aided by a perversely designed drug delivery device. And hundreds of millions of dollars are spent perfecting the design of that device so it delivers a precise aliquot of nicotine as rapidly and in a manner that is interpreted as pleasurably as possible. Hundreds of millions of dollars. And yet we kind of think it's just a paper tube stuffed full of leaves. If I mention freebasing, I'm going to assume that many of you think of cocaine. Never make assumptions. Freebasing was invented by the tobacco industry. You add formaldehyde and ammonia to the tobacco leaf mixture, and the smoke that's produced when that leaf is ignited is more basic, it's more alkaline. And nicotine is driven even more rapidly across the alveolar membrane, and the world's most popular cigarette became such, not because people like cowboys or Formula One race cars, but because Marlboro was the world's free-basing cigarette. a strategy which is now reflected in the design and manufacture of cigarettes all over the globe. And we also lose sight of the fact that when you inhale tobacco smoke, you are delivering via the pulmonary circulation nicotine and the other agents within tobacco smoke directly into the arterial system. And so you get stratospheric elevations of nicotine in the arterial system delivered 4 or 5 seconds later to areas in the brainstem, where they attach themselves to nicotine receptors, which ignite a cascade of neurological transmission, culminating not the least of which in the release of large quantities of dopamine in the forebrain. And it's important for us as clinicians to understand that the neural architecture, the neurophysiology, the neuropharmacology of smokers is different from that of smokers. The moment you become addicted to nicotine, you induce a stupendous upregulation of nicotine receptors. And ever thereafter, in order to maintain some sense of neurophysiological equanimity, a smoker requires the constant administration of nicotine. And while there are all kinds of relationships that you and I as physicians understand and appreciate between medications and foodstuffs, and who doesn't know that grapefruit juice can interfere or impair the metabolism of statin therapies, for instance, most clinicians are blissfully unaware, because we failed in our responsibility to educate them, about some very commonplace relationships between smoking and other health circumstances. If you metabolize nicotine rapidly, you are highly unlikely ever to become a smoker. Pardon me, I got that wrong. If you metabolize nicotine slowly, you are highly unlikely to ever be a smoker. If you metabolize nicotine rapidly, it is much more difficult for you to become a non-smoker. Yet most clinicians are not aware that if you put a woman on the birth control pill, you probably double her rate of nicotine metabolism. And if a woman becomes pregnant, her rate of nicotine metabolism may even quintuple. Why would we need to know that? This is just a habit. If people were just better people, they should be able to get their ducks in a row, shouldn't they? When are you going to start listening to me? And so it's important that we dispel ourselves of some of those outdated Presbyterian kind of approaches and adapt a similar kind of approach to the management of smoking cessation as we would any other cardiovascular risk factor. We identify the problem. We make a clinical decision which may involve pharmacotherapy. We manage that pharmacotherapy, we monitor it, we titrate it, we combine it, we use it for as long as is necessary. The paradigm of smoking cessation is being transformed. We went from Presbyterian to Presbyterian light. I'll give you a little bit of help, but just for a few weeks, and then you should be able to do it, shouldn't you? We don't put casts on and take them off after 6 weeks, because that's when the bone is supposed to have healed. But doctor, my ankle still, it doesn't matter. Plaster's been on 6 weeks. We don't treat hypertension by saying we're going to start you on hydrochlorothiazide 50 milligrams a day for 4 weeks, drop you down to 25 milligrams a day for the next 4 weeks, 12.5 milligrams a day for the final 2 weeks of your hypertension control attempt, bring you back to the office, measure you're still hypertensive. Why don't you go away and think more seriously about when you're prepared to make your next hypertension control attempt in order that we can. That's smoking cessation circa 1995, circa 2000. So there's a whole lot more that we can understand, and there are a whole array of approaches that we can employ to help our smoking patients. And remember, brainstem trumps cerebral cortex. Fact one, the overwhelming majority of smokers know why they shouldn't smoke. Fact two, the majority of smokers do not want to be smokers. Fact three, a substantial proportion of them will make at least 1 or 2 personal, private quit attempts each year, 95% of which will fail. And so you can internalize and cerebrate about the importance of smoking cessation, but if the brainstem, that reptilian part of your brain, says, bathe me in nicotine, or I'm going to make you feel very uncomfortable, we know who's likely to win. And there are other relationships which are very, very important in 2011, the relationship between significant psychiatric illness and smoking. 18% actually of Canadians are smokers, represented by the slide on the left, but the majority of individuals who have a history of depression or who are currently suffering from depression are smokers. Why might that be? Well, something is lighting up the scans on the left, the scans of the non-smokers. Something that is absent from the smokers. And that something is monoamine oxidase. Because hundreds of times a day, smokers administer small doses of monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which, as we all know, are antidepressant medications. And so irrespective of how someone stops smoking, it is not unusual for symptoms of depression to appear shortly after cessation, because the self-medication with these compounds or chemicals is no longer occurring. There are other relationships. There's a very common relationship between caffeine ingestion and smoking, which many clinicians are unaware of. If you smoke and drink 4 or 5 cups of coffee a day, not an uncommon relationship. The polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in tobacco smoke induce cytochrome P450 and other enzymes which accelerate the metabolism of nicotine. And so if you stop smoking and continue to have 4 or 5 cups of coffee a day, over the course of several days, you will begin to experience levels of caffeine which to you feel as if you've had 10, 12, or 15 cups of coffee a day. So these are very prosaic kind of relationships, very commonplace, but they underscore the lack of sophistication of which we have been guilty in terms of approaching smokers and trying to help them. All smokers smoke to maintain a certain level of nicotine. Standard doses of, for instance, nicotine replacement therapy fail to meet those nicotine needs in terms of extinguishing craving and withdrawal in a substantial proportion of cases, and so we have a therapeutic gap when we use conventional doses. And there are a whole variety of what I term zombie concepts, ideas which are outdated and which lurch towards you out of the grave, and you knock them off with your lightsaber, or so you think you have, and you turn around and there are 50 more.